Welcome to all of you. It is a Zoom meeting as opposed to the webinar, so we can all see each other if we want to. So the only rule really is to keep your microphone switched off, make sure you're muted during the event. Towards the end, we'll perhaps have an opportunity to have one or two people bringing a question to the panel. We'll kind of see how it goes, see how the conversation goes. But it's great to welcome the panel, and I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Mercedes Williams, who is going to introduce this event and lead us through and chair it for us. So over to you, Mercedes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. Really appreciate it. And a huge welcome to everyone who's in the room. And it's great to see your faces, and it's great to see your interest in what is a really important conversation. And so we're thrilled to be able to host not only Dr. Amy Donovan, who's the author of our newest Cambridge paper, but 3 panelists who will participate in that conversation. And so I just wanted to open up the event with a bit of a briefing to describe some of the themes that I'm hoping we'll be able to address today, and give you a bit of a background as to why this is called Generous Conversations as opposed to simply Cambridge Papers Live. So this event, Facing the Climate Crisis, is really born out of a desire to see Christians equipped not only with knowledge and understanding about some of the critical issues of our time, but with the increased capacity to engage well across lines of difference, different understanding, different experiences, different views potentially about things, through the practice of generous conversations. And so what I mean by generous conversations is the ability to listen well to others, to pursue together a greater mutual understanding, to recognize that the piece that we know and understand is perhaps sometimes one piece of a much bigger puzzle. And when we're looking at really complex issues, we can all learn from one another. And that's especially true because we live in an age of great polarization and cancel culture, where having a view or an opinion about something that's different from someone else is difficult at times. And what's more so is that Christians are also oftentimes divided due to different views, different experiences, and that within the body of Christ globally, there is a really diverse range of experience and understanding, ranging from the felt impacts of climate change and environmental degradation, as well as perhaps our theological understandings of it. And so the goal of this conversation is not to erase difference, and neither is it to legitimize every idea, but it's to use the expertise in Dr. Donovan's paper as a springboard for conversation, to hear from our 3 panelists who bring really unique perspectives and experiences to help broaden our understanding of what Dr. Donovan's spoken about, and ultimately to seek truth and deeper understanding that motivates a response to this as one of the critical issues of our time that is born out of love. And so I'd now like to introduce our 4 guests to you by giving a short bio of their I guess where they're coming from, but also by asking them the question, what motivates you personally to engage with climate change? So I'll begin with Dr. Amy Donovan. So Dr. Amy Donovan is a university lecturer in the Department of Geography in Cambridge on environmental risk, and a fellow of Girton College in the University of Cambridge. Her research examines the interface between science and society in areas at risk from a range of natural hazards. And as I mentioned, Amy is the author of our newest Cambridge paper, Reducing Disaster Risk, Climate Care and Neighbor Love. So Amy, if I can ask you the question, what motivates you personally to engage with these issues?
I guess there's 2 sides to it for me. There's the one side of sort of seeing the creation and how amazing it is. And, there's nothing like experiencing a volcanic eruption for showing you just how great God is and how small you are. And then the other side of it is that we have huge amounts of knowledge and increasing capacity to understand and mitigate disasters, but we don't steward that knowledge well, we don't use it very well, and there's a massive difference between how the same hazard will affect a community that's wealthy and how it will affect a community that's not. And I think there's a sort of a sense of justice that really motivates me to try to understand that, not just how we use knowledge better, but also how we look after each other better and love each other better.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Amy. And next, I'd like to introduce Hiroya Chua. So Hiroya has been working in international humanitarian aid for the last decade or more, and is currently working with Plan International UK, helping them to grow their humanitarian and resilience portfolio, with a particular focus on education in emergencies in West Africa, Central America, and Latin America. Hiroya originally grew up in Ethiopia, and so he brings that perspective as well, and has also managed numerous development and humanitarian response projects, and approaches his work with a lot of passion and respect for people who are affected by disasters. So I'm sure there's, as with each of you, there's much more that you could say, but in response to the question, Hiroya, what motivates you personally to engage with climate change?
Thanks, Mercedes. Like Amy said, it's also several things for me. So partly it's to do with growing up in Ethiopia and having an aha moment when I was 19, when I did my undergraduate in Addis Ababa, and just went to Addis Ababa University. That's where I was introduced to my country, and I had grown up in it, because I grew up in a slightly different, a slightly middle-class environment in Addis. But I got to really experience what Ethiopia was like in all its diversities. I don't know if Amy or Cheba or any of academics have worked in Ethiopia. It's a very fascinating place. And Addis Ababa University is a sort of a microcosm of that. And so just spending 5 years there of my life, getting to know lots of people from the country, and just growing in the conviction that I want to work in development and socioeconomic transformation. But then having started in development work, understanding that you can't just do development. You also want to look at crisis. You want to look at how you build resilience of people to crisis. It's quite an interconnected theme. So it's predominantly like a profession, an existential. So it wasn't like I sat down and thought about what are my convictions. It's very much a lived experience.
Yeah, I'm gonna wait to hear more about that until just a little bit later on, Harry, but thank you so much for being with us. Next, I'll introduce Hannah. So Hannah Eves is an executive assistant and researcher at Arosha. Previously, she worked with Theos on the social cohesion and religious London projects. Hannah has an MA in governance and political development, and prior to working with Theos, she worked with the Jubilee Centre on a research project looking at food, relationships, and environment, and is one of the co-authors of our book, Thoughtful Eating. Hannah, what motivates you personally to engage with climate change?
Thanks, Mercedes. I mean, it all started really, I think, with the Jubilee Centre in many ways, because I got really inspired by thinking relationally about the environment and thinking about a theology of the environment, which sees us in relationship with both the natural world and with God, but also God in relationship with creation, and kind of an interconnectedness between these three relationships. I think for me, it kind of all hinges on justice, that this is a justice issue, and that our sisters and brothers overseas in more vulnerable places are suffering in a very physical and real way. So I think that neighbourly love and that call to justice really motivates me in my work.
Awesome. Thanks, Hannah. Next, and last but not least, I'd like to introduce Professor Terry Young. So Terry has divided his career between business and the academy, and is now a consultant specializing in modeling scenarios to help policymakers, especially in the health service. He brings a background of computer modeling from phonics to care systems, so as business development director in medical systems, and previously or currently associate dean of health partnerships. So Terry, that's a slightly different remit than the others who are here, and I'd like to ask you the same question. What motivates you personally to engage with these questions and issues of climate change?
Thanks very much, Mercedes. Yes, I am coming from a different place, and I guess I'm a bit of a newcomer really into the area in terms of the thinking. I guess there's a couple of things that have really drawn me to want to think about this a lot more. One of them is that I think a lot of the ways in which as Christians we frame our arguments are around guilt. We do a lot of guilt for all kinds of things. It's one of our favorite ways of encouraging people to do things. But But I've wondered, is that the only way in? And so I've spent time trying to think around other ways in which we might approach this. I'm not saying we have a guilt-free Christianity or even guilt-light, but I'm just trying to think if there are other ways in. The other thing is that throughout my life, whether industry as a research engineer or as an academic, I've spent a lot of time in innovation, and I'm really interested by the extent to which the innovative side, and as a Christian, the creativity side of what we have can also play into this space. And I think, again, to my mind, that's an undervalued element of the debate, and I'm quite interested in that part of the debate as well.
Fascinating, definitely. And in fact, this whole realm of creativity and creation as a whole is something that we're going to look at a little bit more from a slightly different lens as we go into Amy's paper. So thank you, Terry, and thank you to Hannah and Hiroya and Amy for being with us today. I'd now like to pass it back to Dr. Amy Donovan, who's going to walk us through her recently published Cambridge paper, Reducing Disaster Risk, Creation Care and Neighbour Love. So Amy, it's over to you.
Thank you. Can you see the slides okay? Okay,
Yeah.
brilliant. The first one is not very exciting, but I'm going to just give a quick overview of the paper. Yeah, I'm going to start off with some of the sorts of facts and figures sides of things from the most recent report from the IPCC 6th assessment report, which is the report from Working Group 1. The Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 reports will be published early next year. So there is still a lot of really important stuff to come from the IPCC 6th assessment report cycle. Working Group 2 works on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. So that links quite closely to what I'm talking about in the paper. And it's kind of, I was a bit annoyed it hadn't come out. It was it's all been delayed by COVID. Every one of the Working Group reports has been delayed. And then Working Group 3 is mitigation, and that will also come out in the new year. So I'm going to talk a bit about the physical science basis stuff, and then go into talking about disasters and some of the other kinds of impacts on creation that climate change is having, and then discuss some of the biblical principles that are outlined in the paper and what that might mean for Christians. Okay, so the role of the IPCC, which I'm sure everybody knows about, is essentially to synthesize what science knows about climate change. So it doesn't do new research. It takes the research from the literature and it synthesizes it and says, this is what we know at this point. It does use models. So it uses sets of models that get upgraded each time. So it has a new set of models for this assessment report, but it also uses a lot of information from paleoclimate studies. So that's studies of past climates that use geology or ice cores or tree rings or things like that to try to understand climate changes that have happened in the past, which can inform our understanding, particularly of the extent of human influence on the climate system. And this report is very interesting in lots of ways because it has taken forward some of the kinds of the ways the IPCC has been critiqued or misunderstood in the past, and it's quite clear in this new report about confidence levels, particularly, not just in confidence in the knowledge, so confidence in the scientific studies, how many studies have been done that show this thing, but also confidence in the human contribution towards the climate change that we're witnessing. So the sorts of things that come out of it are really very strongly, we have very high confidence in a lot of places that the climate changes that we're witnessing, which in the case of this figure, this is a new way of looking at a global map. It's actually a map, but it's divided into regions. So that's the North America, this is sort of Europe and Asia. And in each region, they've looked at, they've done this for a range of different experiences. So they've done hot extremes, they've also got one on precipitation and so on. This one is for change in hot extremes. You can see they've increased almost everywhere because that's the pink color. But then they're also looking at the confidence that the increase in that area is caused by human activity. So this is quite a complicated way of analyzing the scientific evidence, but it's also really, really important that we have these kinds of assessments of confidence in the scientific knowledge that we have. And again, there's been a huge amount of work in different ways of trying to represent that in the sixth assessment report. And one of the great things about reading the IPCC reports as an academic is that you go through and you're sort of, I have new figures now, I can put in all my lectures. And that's one of the, it's been really nicely timed for the new academic year. And they have got some quite good illustrations throughout the report. There's also in this report a building on a report in 2018, the SREX report, which looked at extremes, particularly extreme events and climate change. The confidence levels have increased significantly that warming is related to an increase both in the frequency and in the intensity of environmental hazards, particularly things like tropical cyclones. So that includes hurricanes and typhoons, which are essentially the same thing, but in different parts of the world, and cyclones in the Indian Ocean. But also things like flooding as a result of intense rainfall. You might possibly, depending on what newspapers you read, you might have read about some of the really unusual, really intense late monsoonal rains in Nepal that have caused some fairly catastrophic landslides in the last few days. There's been a bit about that, certainly in the geology blogs and so on, but I doubt it's made many of the media outlets that we get these days in the UK. But again, the intensification of the monsoon, for example, is one of the things that has been identified as likely a result of climate change. But all of these kinds of hazards, we're seeing an increased incidence of them. And at the same time, we've got really big challenges with environmental degradation as a result of human behavior and development, what we refer to as poor development practice. And all of this kind of creates a perfect storm if you're living particularly in sort of informal communities in sub-Saharan Africa or in Latin America, where there just isn't the infrastructure to cope with these sorts of things. And governance is challenging in lots and lots of regions, and that's certainly not just a problem in the global south. The impacts of disasters are ridiculously uneven across the world. So this is a diagram from a paper that was published a few years ago that shows the deaths in disasters by the size of so the size of the country represents the number of people killed. And you can see that in some parts of Africa and South Asia, and Asia particularly suffers in this way, China, India, Bangladesh, Nepal to some extent as well. All of these countries really disproportionately suffered deaths. In the global south, it is people dying that is the really big outlier in terms of disasters. And I should say that overall, deaths in disasters have decreased relative to population since over the very long term. But in terms of climate events, there are increases in the number of climate events that are affecting people, and there are massive increases in population that are playing into that dynamic. Populations living in informal settlements particularly. In terms of GDP, there's much less kind of about impact kind of by modality, but there are problems with high levels of losses in some parts of the global south as well. If you look at the absolute values of money that is lost in disasters, it's much, much higher in the richer countries because they have more to lose. But if you look at it relative to GDP, the global south still suffers disproportionately. And relative to GDP is essentially what really matters. And again, this is from the World Bank in 2018. That's another sort of measure of well-being, that it is, again, global south countries that are poorer that struggle the most in disasters. There is a huge inequality between the global north and the global south. And within and this does affect the developed world as well, very significantly. So these are just some figures from NOAA in the US, which is sort of the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency in America. And they have seen a significant increase in the average long-term number of billion-dollar disasters that's adjusted for inflation, but they're seeing much more in terms of environmental, particularly obviously climate related hazards in the US that are costing large amounts of money. So even the countries where the infrastructure is very good and there are warning systems most of the time that function are still seeing an increase in climate related events. And there is more and more confidence from the IPCC report that this is related to anthropogenic or human influenced climate change. In the paper, I've talked quite a lot about early warning systems and things like that, the technologies that we have that we don't use or share very well. And this is one of the big challenges really, is the inequality of knowledge and resource between different countries in terms of mitigating and managing disasters. But the other really big driving factor is vulnerability. It is the wealth inequalities between the North and the South, and the challenges of development practice, developing in a way that is risk sensitive and resilient, rather than maybe maximizing profit for construction agencies, for example. And a number of the places I work, there is this political drive to create wealth that leads to really bad development that then actually puts people at risk. And that's one of the really big challenges for researchers working with practitioners, to influence government at the right level to try to get changes in procedures so that you end up with risk sensitive development rather than dangerous kinds of development. Climate change is also having really big impacts on biodiversity. And one of the most kind of publicized of those is the effect on coral ecosystems, which are very, very fragile at the best of times. And small changes in ocean temperature and acidification can kill coral. And there has been huge coral death measured globally across lots of different places. That combines with things like pollution and extraction. There's a lot of companies now getting permission to drill into the seafloor to extract minerals, for example. That doesn't help. So there are lots of different human impacts that are having really detrimental effects on creation and making sure, taking what is something that is God's and just destroying it, essentially, which is obviously very, very sad and not what we're told we should be doing in Genesis, in the Psalms, and so on. So in the paper, I talked a bit about some of the biblical principles that I've been thinking of around creation, that we have a tendency, and this comes from Enlightenment science, this kind of idea that nature is a thing we should study, that it's separate, and that culture and nature are separate things. But actually, of course, culture has been influenced hugely by nature. Nature is increasingly influenced by culture. And biblically, there is no concept of nature as something that is separate. Humans are part of creation. We have a special role within creation and a special responsibility within creation. But what defines us is as part of that creation that God has made. He is the maker, he is the creator, and we are the creation. The Bible also teaches us that creation is something that belongs to God and that gives him glory. So it worships him. If we mar it, then we are ultimately marring that worship. We are told we can use it. We're told to govern it. And the kind of biblical principles around governance, which I didn't have time to go into lots of detail on because that would be a whole other paper. But we know that what makes a good king, because we have Jesus, we know what makes a good ruler, and that's what we're told to be, but it's not really what we currently are being. We're not caring for the well-being of the creation in the way that we're told to. And there are lots of passages in scripture, I mentioned some of them in the paper, that suggest being kind to animals, being thinking about sustainable practices so that you can keep harvesting grain and all of these kinds of things. There's lots of really interesting passages that talk about specific things that give us some principles we can work with. And then there's the other side of this, which is that if we actually degrade the creation around us, we also have really quite bad impacts on other people, and we're told we shouldn't be doing that either. So the neighbour love element of the paper really tries to get to some of those inequalities and challenges and injustices that are perpetuated largely by a very small fraction of the global population in the global north, but that have absolutely devastating impacts in parts of the global south. And that's not just climate change, that's also things like pollution, waste disposal, sending plastic all over the place rather than actually recycling it, as you say you're going to do. And that is really, really complicated business that none of us individually can really get to the bottom of. You know, it's very hard to be a perfectly ethical consumer because most of the time it's very hard to get information about exactly where all your products are coming from and where all the waste is going. We can try to do that to some reasonable way, but actually there is also a responsibility to lobby politicians, and I'll come on to that in a minute. And we do have a responsibility to use knowledge equitably and wisely and responsibly as well, and that also comes across in scripture, that there are points, so in Ezekiel 33, where the watchman has the role of warning people. If we are warned that something is happening, as we have been a lot about climate change, it is our responsibility to take some action on the basis of those warnings. So all of the evidence that we have suggests we're really failing in our stewardship of the non-human creation and also the human creation around us. Our failure to steward these things well is having really, really horrible impacts on some of our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world, and even in this country or in the US or other developed countries as well. Climate change is one example. It's probably one of the biggest examples. There are others. And climate change also emphasizes and kind of amplifies some of the existing inequalities and injustices within human society as well. What can we do? There's different things that we can do. As individuals, we can take some lifestyle actions, eat less meat. You know, if everybody becomes a vegan, there are issues for livelihoods, there's issues for land use, there's all kinds. It's not a binary thing, but it is about moderation and you know, taking decisions where we can and where it's reasonable to live in a more sustainable way, and maybe think about which companies we buy from if there are particular companies that are not behaving ethically. But there is a problem in our society that a lot of this stuff gets put on individuals. And actually the big problems are systemic problems. They're problems with the way that the economic system in some countries functions. They're problems with the ways that particular companies and particular political actors behave. And that's where there is a really important need for Christians to be a voice in speaking out against these kinds of injustices. And trying to influence policy and influence decision-making at lots of different levels of politics, from the international all the way down to local level. And again, we have a lot of freedom to pick how we do that and what charities we work with, or what groups we lobby, or what issues we are interested in. And we can use money and time and things in an appropriate way to try to support some of those causes as well. So that's a sort of whistle-stop tour of some of the things that I've talked about in the paper. And I think I will stop sharing there and move on to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amy, for bringing us through some of the key things that you've written about in your paper. If those of you in the audience, if you've not yet read Amy's paper, I really recommend it. It was well articulated. And one of the things, Amy, that you spoke about in your paper that I feel articulated something really central for us as Christians is that actually how we respond to the environment, how we respond to creation, is ultimately an act of love and worship towards God. Like, He has made this creation of which we are a part, we are not separate from it. How we relate to the creation in some way reflects how we view and worship the Lord. And at the same time, knowing those connections between the health of the environment and the impacts to brothers and sisters around the world who are maybe spatially distant, but are not relationally distant. that is also an act of love, and we are called to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And so I think for those in the audience who may not grasp the complexity of science that you are so fluent in, that one idea for me really struck home. It's like, actually, this is about love. Ultimately, this is about our identity as followers of Jesus, and it's about love. And if we come together around that idea, then there can be a really fruitful and creative conversation about, okay, how do we respond to some of these challenges? So thank you, Amy. Thank you so much for taking the time to write and also share your paper. And picking up on that idea of love, and something that Terry, you mentioned in your introduction, but surely there's a way to engage in this that's actually not about guilt. I'd like to invite you now to respond to Amy's paper, offering perhaps one response to the paper itself, and one point that is within the broader conversation of climate. And so we've got about 6 minutes to do that, if I can pass that to you now.
Thanks. Give me a yell after 4. I hope not to take 6. Anyway, the thing I suppose I most appreciated about the paper, I'm not sure quite how you want responses done, so I'll dig in and then you can tell everybody else not to do it that way. I really liked the attempt to capture the complexities that were there. I thought that was nice and well taken, and the move away from binary thinking to shades of grey, the attempt to connect our theology with our sort of science and working jobs and stuff like that. I really liked all of that, and I particularly liked the practical examples of for instance, the early warning systems that are in the written paper around distinguishing between tsunamis and earthquakes, and the way that those can really be important. And I like the framework that's emerging. I think that there's a lot more to be done in terms of developing the frameworks, but I think as Christians, we've got to be trying to make the connections that are difficult and that we're not going to agree with in terms of the importance of this connection against that one. In terms of the wider picture, I guess I was intrigued by the whole question of technology and wealth and how that fits in. And clearly there's one, a normal strand is to think that people from rich countries should always pay for stuff from other countries. And there was an example in the paper about how if you do it through projects, then sometimes when the projects fail, the stuff doesn't get repaired. I'm particularly interested in the whole innovation front, as I would be. And I think there's 2 or 3 things that are really important. One is that the more we buy of new stuff, the cheaper it becomes, and therefore the more affordable it becomes in other countries. And I don't think that Christians necessarily see their role as buying their way to solving the problem, but there are areas where being better consumers, every time we buy solar panels, the cost of solar panels continues to come down. But there is an element around that I think is quite interesting and worth exploring. And I think the role of technology in supporting people. I think the other things that are interesting are that as Christians, we can help to create wealth in other countries. And there are Christians who see themselves as entrepreneurs who particularly target countries that are poor and are looking to try and help bring up and create local wealth and stuff like that. So there's a variety of quite off the beaten track at the moment responses that Christians could think about. At the moment in our own country, there's quite a big debate on innovation, whether Boris is going to, how much he's going to put into innovation. And that's not considered a particularly Christian thing for us to be involved in, stepping up and saying we believe in more innovation. That's our birthright. But I think that's something that we could do. We tend to think of climate as being something Christians should be involved in, innovation as being something secular. I think, there's lots and lots of fun stuff going on here for Christians to get stuck into. How many minutes was that, Mercedes?
That was about 3 minutes. 3 minutes, Terry. So would you like 1 more minute?
No, I'm quite happy to come in later on.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I think actually I'd like to move to Hiroya next, because I know that part of what you do that I didn't get to mention in your introduction is that you help businesses also that want to invest in different parts of the world by providing kind of due diligence, strategic insight, and political risk analysis. So perhaps that's something that you'd want to mention, but maybe now, maybe later. I'd like to ask you to respond to Amy's paper and bounce off Terry's points and any other aspects of this kind of topic that you feel are important at this stage.
Sure. Thanks, Mercedes. I wasn't massively thinking about mentioning my consultancy work that I do on the side, but it is a nice segue into how I've thought about responding to Amy's paper. And that is, so the way I was thinking about it was to sort of reflect on three things that I really wanted to sort of, that jumped out at me. I love the whole paper, just to put it out there, just to kill the suspense, love the whole paper, but I wanted to pull out the three things that specifically spoke to me. And then talk about how personally for me, because this is such a broad area, how am I thinking about taking this area forward? And I wanted to sort of offer it. I don't know if it would help anybody, but again, to kill the suspense, it's predominantly around, how do I have a more existential, immersed, real life involvement with nature, with people, with my neighbors. So it's not just conceptual and abstract. And I'll talk about what I mean by that in a minute, but it sort of flows, links to some of the suggestions that Amy also gave us towards the end of her paper. So the three things that particularly jumped out at me, firstly, the complexities, and this is something that Terry has also mentioned, but just one area of complexity that I wanted to pull out specifically, and the way you set up the context, Amy, I really appreciate it, because like I said, I grew up in Ethiopia, and I had opportunities to visit different parts of Ethiopia. And there are some pastoralist communities that have their own ways of wealth redistribution. Perhaps we might not necessarily do it this way, but I'm pretty sure lots of communities did it this way in the past. But it has to do with raids and counter raids. And then something perhaps violent happens, somebody dies, and then there are honor killings, revenge killings and so on. And then finally it escalates, but so it doesn't completely get out of hand. Traditional elders come together, discussions happen, resolutions take place, compensations are paid, and then relationships are restored. And in all of that context, you have that social relationship that's restored, wealth relationships that are some sort of balance has been created, and that society functions really well. It might not be, again, like not in the way that modern society would want to function, but it does function. What I have seen, like I said, over the decades is all of these relationships are now taking place in a world that's rapidly warming up, and resources are being drained. And all of a sudden, this pastoralist community would quickly find out that its grazing land has radically shrunk, or the waters are drying up. And so those raids or counter raids or those conflicts suddenly become existential. So I can't live if you also live and you're also sharing these resources. And within that context, those traditional ways of managing those conflicts become strained and almost becomes quite impossible to manage. And so what I really liked about, that aspect of it that I really liked is that it's not really simplistic, this thing. It really interacts with already existing political, economic, social, ideological, cultural differences. And it's in the ways in which all of this now then takes place in a world that's rapidly warming up. That's particularly problematic, at least from what I've seen in life. Secondly, again, I cannot emphasize this enough, the vulnerability aspect. So I've been working in this sector since 2008. And I have now come like this, and I'm not an academic, so I'm sure I can be criticized for this. But for me now, poverty means uninsured life, to my mind. And what I mean about that is there are shocks that take place in everybody's life, in all of our lives, every day. Some inconvenience, maybe you lose a job, maybe health, or maybe, a family member is affected, etc. But because of our resilience, because of the social, economic, family relationships, healthcare, educational opportunities, work opportunities that we've got, these things don't mean that it's not a life threat to me. I can just, carry on with my life. That's not always the case in all parts of the world, not just in developing world, like Amy was saying, the global south, but even within our communities, there are disparities and there are marginalizations. But again, you know, it's a brilliant example in the paper, the difference between, say, your Indonesia and you know, your tsunami response versus your Japan, for example. But I've seen it even within communities. So I've worked in some parts of Latin America and Central America. I've worked in the Sahel belt in West Africa and Central Africa and parts of the Middle East as well. Between these communities, but also even within communities, it does not affect people the same way. You know, some people are just really, really uninsured, you know, and so that vulnerability piece is really, really important. So, and that speaks to that justice piece that Amy mentioned in the paper. I think that's really, really important to highlight. And then thirdly, it's that project aid bit that Terry also mentioned, but links into your introduction just now, Mercedes, as well. And it has to do why I'm a busy guy, I guess, like, you know, I've got a full-time job, I'm involved with various charities, but I also try to do some business work alongside. And that's because of my frustrations within the ed sector. And Amy has touched upon this in the paper, this project-based. I've worked on projects that are seemingly refugee response projects that are only 2 months long, or resilience projects so we had this European Union funded project that was 18 months long, and Cuba was sharing experience with the Dominican Republic, was also sharing experience with Haiti. 18 months, and then it's renewed for another 9 months, then it's randomly renewed for 20 months. Each time it's ever so slightly shifted away from this particular area to another. And it's just, at the end of the day, it's really frustrating. I take a slightly different view. I do think wealth redistribution is important. I take that view, and I'm very happy to defend it later on if necessary. But the way in which the aid sector functions is a little bit frustrating. And I do think that, you know, you want to get to a place where countries are able to enhance their own tax revenues and get to a place where they can, manage their own affairs in the way that they're able to. Hence my involvement with the private sector. But yes, but all this to say, you've touched a chord, Amy, about the aid world. I get existential crisis every couple of months, basically. What am I doing with my life? Is this what I want to do with my life? So I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
okay, so
sorry. We're going to come back. We're going to come back a little bit more to some points in discussion later. But I think you're not the only one working in that sector who's got that regular time of crisis. It's a really complex thing, and some of the challenges that we see globally are beyond what we can. Yeah, it's very difficult. There's a lot more that we can and we will hopefully get into in the discussion part of this. But I'd now like to invite you, Hannah, to respond to Amy's paper with, you know, response to what she's raised, and perhaps one other point that you might feel important to the conversation at this stage.
Thanks, Mercedes. I'm going to have a couple of things that I just thought were really good and really useful in the paper, and just something that kind of relates to some of the work that I'm doing that I would love to draw it a little bit further. So first of all, also I'm going to add to the general consensus that I absolutely loved your paper, Amy, and I thought it was fascinating, and I thought it was really helpful, and I thought it was a really great way of framing the issue. I think the first sort of reaction I had was, I think, as I began to work in this sector and kind of starting off my career, you kind of get this sense of there's lots of different parts moving in this crisis. So there's people, you know, there's campaigners, there's conservationists, there's risk disaster experts, there's development NGOs, there's business, there's so many different moving parts. And so I really enjoyed just spending a bit of time in your expertise and learning more about something that's not my expertise, but is part of this wider debate. And I think that was just really enjoyable and really interesting. And I think that what I really loved about it, and I touched on this in my introduction, was that talk about relationships, and that we have a responsibility to love both creation and our global neighbor. And I really loved how you put it about a special responsibility and how that extends to our work, because we kind of have this thinking about spaces like COP coming up really, really soon, spaces like our workplaces when we're talking about these issues, actually being able to talk about it, being able to think about our responsibility in that sphere is really, really helpful, and relationships in that. Two things that I sort of would draw out just kind of and loved about it was, first of all, there was a line in it about stewarding knowledge. And I sort of hadn't put that together. We talk about stewarding money, we talk about stewarding the environment, stewarding knowledge. I love that. I thought it was fascinating. And in terms of kind of thinking about how we take action later on, I am part of the Young Christian Climate Network, and we've been walking on a relay pilgrimage to COP from the G7 in Cornwall to COP, ending really soon. We're up in Edinburgh at the minute, walking across the. And we've been talking about like climate finance and using money as a way of helping to communities in developing and global South nations. So things like restoring the aid budget, I think that's a really, really key thing that needs to happen. I think also, then hopefully this might resonate in Jubilee Centre circles, is talking about debt and the debt that these countries go into when they have to mitigate, when they have to deal with climate related disasters. Those most climate vulnerable have to go into debt to deal with those disasters, and they often end up borrowing off countries in the global north, and then they make a profit off it, those in the global north. It's, you know, I think that's a really interesting part of the debate, and that would be something I'd love to kind of talk about. I think the final thing is Amy talked about in her presentation, and I think in a paper too, about biodiversity crisis. And we at Russia are really concerned about nature. That's our whole kind of work. And we are going to be at COP26. We're going to be lobbying on nature-based solutions. And I think our love for the creation has to kind of extend towards what that looks like. We love creation because it's good, because it's beautiful, because it gives us life. But also nature is going to be absolutely critical in the climate debate. We have to protect our forests. We have to protect our carbon sinks. We have to protect the ocean. And kind of having joined up thinking about climate and nature as a way of caring for creation as Christians, we're called to steward this world, but also as a very practical way of combating the climate crisis. So I love what you're kind of bringing in about biodiversity, and then kind of adding to that about how we can use nature-based solutions to actually kind of help us in this crisis, which is the climate crisis. Mercedes, have I gone over? Am I under? How's it looking?
I think that was about 4 minutes, Hannah. So you've got 1-2 minutes more if you'd like to take it.
Well, I think I'm good. I think that covered all of the kind of things that really came to mind when I read the paper. And thanks again, Amy, for it.
Yeah, fantastic. Amy, I'd like to give you the opportunity now to respond to any of the points that our three panelists have offered, if you'd like to.
Yeah, mostly I just agree. Yeah, on the innovation thing, I think it's an interesting area, and obviously it's something that I've looked into in terms of early warning systems. And I mean, it's somewhere where there's a balance, because some of the narratives that we're going to see coming out of the COP are going to be around how we can engineer our way out of the climate crisis so we don't have to change our behavior. And I'm always wary of buying into that, partly because we have a really checkered track record when it comes to developing new technologies that actually do what we think they're going to do and want them to do, and work properly, and don't have unintended side effects. So there are lots of great, solar panels and innovation in making solar panels more efficient and cheaper and not so dependent on things like rare earth elements, which produces huge problems for mining, extraction, and all of these kinds of things. That's all great, that sort of innovation. But the kinds of things where you're looking at geoengineering of the atmosphere to try and, inject stratospheric aerosols, all of these kinds of things, there are really big ethical issues around that, particularly in terms of how it's governed, but also just we don't actually really know what the impacts would be. So I think innovation is really, really important, but I also think it has its limits, and we have, the classic example is nuclear technology or climate change. In both cases, the massive detrimental side effects, the radiation sickness wasn't foreseen. And of course, climate change is the result of development and also was not foreseen in the processes of development. And there's a whole sociology around this kind of stuff. If anybody's heard of Ulrich Beck, he talks a lot about this kind of unexpected side effects of modernization. And I always want to bear that in mind and not assume that humans know best and can engineer the earth out of the crisis. So I think, yeah, innovations around sort of renewable energies and things like that, a lot of very exciting work being done. And yeah, complexity and vulnerability, again, I would massively echo the emphasis on vulnerability. I think that's really, really important. And that is essentially the big result of the last 40 years of disaster studies. Is disasters are about vulnerability. Whether or not a hazard event becomes a disaster is about whether the vulnerability levels of that population. And that has a lot to do with wealth distribution. And it is to do with poverty. It's also to do with marginalization of particular groups and the power dynamics within society, power dynamics, even on a very small scale, as you say, within Ethiopia, but also, and within communities, in London as well. There's also, we see the same pattern. Hurricane Katrina is another classic example now in the disasters literature of where the more marginalized, least empowered communities suffered much worse. We see that globally. So vulnerability is the thing that really drives disaster risk. And yeah, project-based, I could just rant about that indefinitely, so I won't. The aid, structures of aid and the way that aid is used. And again, yeah, I think that the stuff Hannah was saying as well, I just completely agree with a lot of that there are huge injustices in the way that the global north behaves and makes profits, and there's a lot of things we don't see. We live in this, it's kind of ironic because we live in the information age where we get all the information we need, but we just don't get it because we are so dependent on the media to select things, and we just don't get some of these kinds of narratives around financing, around debt, and the dynamics of large multinational companies as well as countries. In terms of how they actually keep poor people poor in large parts of the world, and enhance and amplify the marginalization of particular groups as well. And that is a really big and really challenging area. Yeah, but I could reflect for a long time, but I won't. I will hand back to Mercedes.
Yeah. As I was rereading your Cambridge paper earlier, I was struck by the last page, and I'll just briefly mention and highlight something from your paper, in the sense that the 2017 report estimated that $1.5 trillion in African resources is controlled by 101 companies listed on the London Stock Exchange, 25 of which are based in tax havens. So that really stood out to me, that actually the role that the West, and you mentioned Britain having a disproportionate role here, is actually limiting development. And so there's this aspect of deep injustice, not only in our response to climate, but in the makings of some of the inequities that we see in the world. And for us as believers, when we look at that kind of thing, serving a God who loves justice and seeing that flagrant kind of injustice, there's a response required that can have a personal application, regional, national, international application, but there is some sense of responsibility to engage in moving away from that and towards a more just world. And so one of the questions that has been raised, that we've got a lot of excellent comments coming through in the chat. I'm trying to divide my attention between listening to those who are speaking and also being attentive to that. So if I miss something in there, please don't feel ignored. Just recognize the challenges of Zoom. But a question that I know a lot of people might have is the tension between seeing the gravity of the situation at hand, both in terms of environmental degradation, but human implication in corruption, injustice. The list really goes on, and feeling in some sense as humans we're inadequate to actually solve or change or bring about the redemption of these things on our own. And so there's this idea, God is the one who's going to save this. we can't really do it, and therefore let's just trust that one day a redemption will come. And so while that is, in some sense, there is a truth to there being a final redemption, I like to draw out, in some sense, maybe a more creative view on that involves us as image bearers of the Lord, called to participate in the remaking of all things, even at this stage, knowing that we are still waiting for a final redemption of all things. Does that question make sense? And so I'd like to invite our three panelists, Terry, Hannah, and Hiroya, back. If we can tease that out a little bit, looking at the tension between kind of this final salvation and redemption and the ongoing work of redemption that we see and trust, actually, that we're called to participate in. So.
Okay, so from my perspective, I don't follow necessarily all of the paths that we're taking at the moment in taking stuff as a given. I think that there is a connection between human creativity and God's creative mandate. I think it's a bit more complicated than we perhaps indicate. I do believe that we're not going to save our way out of the climate question. I think we're going to see over the next 6 months, even in this country, how frantically expensive responses are. And I think we're going to have to find some creative ways to either generate more money or to generate more ideas. So I'm really, as an individual, I guess I'm really interested in how innovation works out. How you as a Christian tie together your innovative instincts and your instincts for evangelism and for fulfilling the planet with joy, those are really difficult areas. I just think we need to be thinking a lot more about how those things go together, because I really do think that we're going to have to find some very, very creative breakthroughs. I accept Hannah's. I'm also worried about seeding clouds and that kind of stuff at that level, because the energy involved in these things is so huge that you just don't know what's going to happen once you put stuff up there. Let's not forget that I think the US DoD put about $500 billion into fusion research, and it hasn't paid off yet. Had it paid off, we wouldn't be having this discussion probably. We'd be having something about pollution probably, but not about energy. And so there are ways in which human creativity, even non-Christian human creativity, is heading in the right direction. The government seems to think that we're going to have relatively safe nuclear options by 2040. Whether we will or not, I don't know. But somehow we have to be thinking about how we break through some of these things if we're going to make a real impact. So from my perspective, I think what I'd like to feed into the debate is that the human creativity, and that has to do with what we buy as well as what and how we do it as a business, as well as how we invent stuff, because you can't invent something just at a price. The price comes down as you make more of it. And I think that there are a lot of things that Christians can be thinking about. They just don't sound very Christian at the moment, but I think that they will be Christian as we take them and dedicate them and then turn them into productive responses to this challenge. Don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but I think it's quite a difficult area.
Yes. Yes, I think it is. Hiroya or Hannah, would you like to respond and feed into that? I would actually like to challenge the word debate, because sometimes a debate polarizes us, and that's actually, I think, one of the main challenges that we face today, is that even as Christians, we fall along these polarized lines where it's difficult to hear each other. And so in this conversation, Hannah or Hiroya, would you like to respond or feed something back to what's been mentioned so far?
Yeah, I think two things kind of strike me from what we've just discussed. First of all, talking about our theology, I think someone put it like this to me really recently, talking about that kind of question of, well, if the world's going to, what's the point in kind of working on it now? And, I think they put it like this, which I thought was really helpful, is just because we may have new relationships and new creation doesn't mean that we aren't called to make peace with our brother and sister. And it's the same way with the climate, just because we still are called to steward and to kind of bring forward our work on earth and kind of really reconcile ourselves with the planet in many ways. And I think the second thing I would add, and I think kind of based also a bit of what Amy said about technological innovation, and I think there are certainly risks and And with nature-based solutions, we're having the same thing. There are risks to it. And the problem, the risk, one of the big risks, and I think it's true of both those areas, is that companies or countries will look at those two things and say, well, we can use tech to get out of it, we can use nature to get out of it. And actually what we need is dramatic cuts in fossil fuel use and in other damaging practices. And so we have to be careful when we're talking about both these things, that we don't rely on them, and that we take this alongside cutting damaging activities, which we know from our scientific evidence are contributing to climate change. And so that was kind of my addition to that, was that kind of balancing those two things and not letting tech be used as an excuse, kind of exciting innovations be an excuse to not make those cuts now, because I think we need them now.
Thanks, Hannah.
I have a slightly left field view on this that I'm sure Mercedes will know. So I am Eastern Orthodox. I've got I've got my cross and everything. So I find, if you permit me, that question is a very Western Christian, Protestant, perhaps Catholic, I'm not sure, way of looking at it. So it's just not something that comes to mind in the East. It's a very sacramental tradition. The Lord Jesus, the God man, we call him, so he's not just God anymore, but he's also part of creation. He's both creator and creation at the same time. And in that union with creation, creation is very different, in the way that we meet him now in our baptism, in our regeneration. That's creation, that's water giving rebirth to people. In the Eucharist, that's water, that's grain, that's wine, part of this creation. But through the work of the Spirit, we believe that becomes the body and blood of Christ, and we commune through creation with God. And so it's a very different, I'm not just what you say on your paper, Amy. Perhaps this is one takeaway, I don't know. It might be interesting to link up with broader Christian traditions to see how, there's a reason why Patriarch Bartholomew, the Patriarch in Constantinople, is called the Green Patriarch. I don't know if how many of you know about this. And even his predecessor, Patriarch Athenagoras, was talking about the environment in the 60s when none of this stuff was fashionable. But just because what you say about nature and separating humanity, it's kind of like explaining the environment for someone that lives in the environment. You go into a church, the icons, the incense, the nature, the water, the bread, everything just sort of hits all of your senses. And so it's a very different way of relating with creation. And so when this idea of just exploit this very thing that's given to us for real, genuine contact with God, but also there's a sort of flip side. Saint Maximus the Confessor, 7th century, used to talk about how we are a microcosm of creation. So we connect both creation, this physical world, through our body, blood, bones, etc., and the spiritual world through our spirit and soul. We bring all of creation to God in our worship. So to fix that around and then exploit. It's a very damaging way. So all of this to say, and then and the combination of all of this is making sure that we are God bearers, what we would say as temples, and creation, all of creation being God bearing, not just as an external house. God does not live in a house, but actually, it's a bit like iron. You put iron in a fire, and it absorbs the nature of fire while still remaining iron. So the view of salvation in the Orthodox tradition is that we're being deified, and all of creation is being deified. In our Eucharistic prayers, we say, quoting John 6:51, he's given his life for the life of the world, the life of the cosmos, not just us as individuals. So sorry, I didn't mean to make this oh my gosh theology thingy, but I'm just also wanting to say, so when we say our Christians, our theology, it's also worth looking at, hang on a minute, there's a broader body of Christian thought that you look at our saints, they've had phenomenal relationships with what we would call wild animals. It's as if like they could sense that primordial relationship human beings were meant to have with creation and a life given to prayer, So yeah, it's great about innovation and everything. So it's the challenge for me is even when the secular world is talking about, in Christian terms, repentance, let's change our way of life. That's repentance. There's a danger I fear of, yes, absolutely, but no, I want to keep on feeding my passions. But I just want to find clever ways of doing it. There's also that balance to be struck, I feel, Anyway, so I think I've probably said more than I should have done, but yeah, thanks. Sorry, Mercedes.
No, I was hoping the way I framed that question would draw out that response. So thank you for speaking to that, because I think one of the callings that we have as Christians is not only to pursue our own understanding of something, but to recognize that the body of Christ is in fact a global body that exists across time and space, and that our understanding of something, particularly Western evangelical tradition, it's not that it's invalid, but that it exists in conversation with other members of the body of Christ in other parts of the world who have a lot of richness and wisdom to bring to it, to the questions of faith, but particularly I would say to the questions of how we view our relationships, and a relationship with a non-human created world being one of those really critical relationships at this stage. So Hiroya, thank you for bringing that. I think it's a really important aspect of enriching our understanding on this. And something I know that Jonathan would say, were he to be speaking right now, is to bring out this aspect of creation, fall, and redemption. In that, in the beginning, God created everything and it was good. Then there was a fall, there was a breach. And I think that's, in many ways, we can look at that as a relational breach that affected our relationship with God, but also relationship with the non-human creation and with each other. And there's this ongoing process of redemption that actually we can return to again and again. And it's not just a one-time fits all thing, but it's actually in every situation, whether it's in our institutions and our relationships, there's a need to constantly move towards redemption. So thank you so much. And before I move on to kind of another question, Terry or Hannah or Amy, would you like to respond to what's been raised so far?
Can I just make one thing that really came up when Hiroya was speaking, is the importance of geography in all of this, and I would say that, wouldn't I? But that there are ways that we can learn from other people in other parts of the world, and it should, that this is something the IPCC I know has tried to do more. It's something that the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has really tried to embed a little bit, although it's arguably not done brilliantly at it. But that there are perspectives that are not rooted in Western capitalism, for example, that are actually really, really important to bring to bear. And I think one of the challenges when you grow up and you spend your whole life in Western Europe or the US or, somewhere where we do have all of these services and all of the kinds of things that we need to live and so on, is that you become blinded to how easy it is for you relative to how it is in another part of the world. And I think Christians in other countries have huge amounts to teach us about how to live in nature or as part of nature much more effectively under God. I feel that, and my own experience of sort of that realization was a bit extreme. So I work on a project we're working with the North Koreans on a volcano and some on disaster risk reduction. And visiting Pyongyang, because it's socialist, you suddenly see all of the elements of capitalism that you're so used to in the West because they're just there all the time and you just don't notice them, but they're not there in Pyongyang. And that really brought home to me the extent to which our wealth distribution and our focus on economic growth for the sake of economic growth actually does blind us in lots of ways. Now, I'm not going to go out and say we should all go socialist on this. Like, we're following the North Korean socialist model, not something I would put forward. But I do think there are alternatives that we don't actually think about, or that might be more driven by scripture than trying to constantly justify economic growth for the sake of economic growth. And there's some quite interesting perspectives I've read coming out of places like the World Economic Forum on this, for example. And I think it's worth engaging with some of those sorts of ideas as well.
Thank you, Amy. I wanted to share a little allegory, a little story that I was reminded of yesterday when I was looking into the life of a remarkable Kenyan leader, Wangari Maathai, who was the founder of the Green Belt movement. I'm not sure how many of us are familiar with her, but if you're not, I recommend taking just a little look in her life. So Wangari Maathai was a Kenyan social, environmental, and political activist. She was the first African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, as well as the first woman in kind of Central Eastern Africa to earn a PhD. And so she was the founder of the Green Belt movement, which has been responsible for planting more than 51 million trees in Kenya and motivating little responses along the way. And so she told a story. I'm sure this story has been told by many people in different cultures, different traditions. I originally heard it coming from an indigenous culture, and it's the story of the hummingbird. And the story goes that there was this enormous forest fire, this massive forest fire, and all of the animals of the forest, the elephants and the tigers and the lions, the wildebeest, they were terrified by the fire and they were running away. They didn't know what to do, and so they did nothing. And the hummingbird, which was the smallest animal that there was, saw the gravity of the situation, but was determined that she would do something. And so she went to the river, and with her tiniest of tiny beaks, she took one drop of water, brought it back and dropped it on the fire. And she continued again and again and again, one drop at a time. And the other animals, the elephant with its long trunk, kind of mocked the hummingbird. "What are you doing?" As if your one drop can do anything to change this forest fire, And the hummingbird said, "I can't do it alone, but I can do what I must do what I can. And that has to be enough. I must do my best." And so I can imagine for Wangari Maathai, when she was experiencing and seeing, the effects of climate degradation, and she was seeing the future as it may unfold, the social, the political, the economic effects, as well as the environmental, she was compelled to begin by planting one tree, and then by teaching others to do the same, by founding movements and communities of people to plant one tree at a time, knowing that could never be the whole solution, but she was compelled to act with that one particular thing. And so in the last few minutes of our conversation, I'd like to look a little bit at what it means to respond practically to some of the challenges that we've spoken about today. With that in mind, for me personally as well, the issue of climate degradation, corruption, poverty, all of the surrounding complications and complex factors, it can be overwhelming if that becomes our point of focus. But I think for us as Christians, we can also draw upon this hope that yes, all things are being redeemed, renewed, but also that we've been made participants in that redemption through love, and that love is ultimately a creative force, and it's powerful. And so whether our action is one drop of water in the beak of a little hummingbird, or you may be positioned in times to come to participate in actually establishing incredible technological innovations that can make a real and sustainable difference to this, or be part of lobbying political groups or establishing development projects. And there's a range of ways in which we participate in this, but I want to keep that in mind, that actually when something is rooted in love and obedience to Christ, it has a different quality to it. And I believe it really has creative potential to bear witness to God's redemption. So I wanted to ask Hannah if you could share a little bit more about your experience as part of the pilgrimage. I believe it was, you were walking from London to Oxford, was it? What did you see, especially in terms of different people coming together kind of in unity and solidarity?
Yeah, so just as a little bit of background, so I was part of the Young Christian Climate Network, and we're still walking, but we're doing this pilgrimage, and the idea is to kind of call attention to climate issues from a place of faith, from a Christian organisation of young people. And we walked, so there's a whole long walk from Cornwall to Glasgow, but I was the kind of route section team leader for London to Oxford. And so I walked I think it was over 70 miles a couple of weeks ago. And actually, one of the things I encountered was, first of all, that there was this kind of real mix of young and old people there. Kind of, we had a lot of people on the walk who were a bit older, who kind of were really keen to support and to kind of take. We had this really moving moment where someone came and apologized to us. We said, well, it's not your fault individually, you know, but he just felt so moved by these young people kind of taking an action. But I think also one of the things we found was just this amazing hospitality of the church, and people in small churches along the way who are just making a little difference, having a climate focused service, talking about creation theology in their churches, joining one of the schemes like Eco Church, kind of signing a petition together and kind of making these little differences, and putting the kind of love of neighbor and love of creation at the center of what they're doing that day in that service. And they were so keen to support us and to welcome us and to feed us and to house us and encourage us and walk with us. And I think that really is something that's really, I've been involved in a lot of projects over the last year involving what the churches are doing around COP and what the churches are doing around the climate. And we find these people who are just doing the small sort of thing in their churches, and it's spreading out. And I think then we come together as a collective voice and we say, you know, we kind of express our love for creation. I think that is really powerful. That's really struck me, both with the pilgrimage and also just with my wider work with projects like Eco Church and Climate Sunday. I'll wrap up because I realize we don't have that much time left. Mercedes, you're on mute, just so you're aware.
Thank you. Thanks, Hannah, for sharing about your experience. And yes, we've got just about 10 minutes left, and before we'll wrap up. And I was just saying, yeah, it's a conversation that could be taken in so many different directions because it is complex and it is important. Terry, I'd like to invite you. Would you like to respond to anything that's been said now? We've pushed back a little bit on this idea of innovation, and yet I do want to affirm the fact that, yeah, creativity is something God-given and can be used in wonderful ways. Would you like to respond at all to what has been said so far?
I'm only trying to find the overlaps between my sort of natural predispositions and my sort of background in terms of feeding something into the conversation that is a little bit different. And I think that the creativity side of things is because most of the people doing the thinking are not actually involved in business. If we look at the way that business is viewed, even from our own community here, it's usually in negative terms because it causes the problem and we're trying to solve it. And I just think that there's perhaps scope for a little bit more flexibility in terms of trying to put the puzzle pieces together of how and why creativity matters and the extent to which it may make a bigger impression. I think, you know, we've been around this. There's really quite a lot of interesting stuff that sort of impinges on this in the discussion panel that's going up in writing in the chat column. I don't really have anything sort of more to add to that. I obviously think it's important. I think it's really complicated to work out how it all fits together. And I would just push back against the fact that we have to do certain things because that's what we have to do. I think a more creative approach says maybe, and let's try and think it through. And that's really what I would make a plea for a little bit more thinking about maybe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Terry. Yeah, absolutely. I think creativity is something that we underestimate, and it can have tremendous potential for good, as it can have tremendous potential for bad, but that it is worth digging into what we can do creatively, thinking innovatively outside the box, and putting those pieces together, like you said, working together, collaborating to move towards practical responses. And Hiroya, one of the things that we chatted about in advance of this conversation was coming together around some kind of concrete, practical things that help us to sidestep polarization in kind of different aspects of debate. Could you point to any examples of that you may have seen in your work, of things that have been really successful, really worth noting, or potentially drawing from?
Sure. I was going to say that. I mean, it's is it possible to draw from a non-disaster risk management example, if that's possible? Then yeah. I think it's sort of a quick preamble to this, and actually just appreciating Terry in the way that you've really modeled generous conversation, actually, which is really really great. And what Mercedes and I were talking about was around how do you get away from when something like, say, climate change is caught up in a cultural moment, what we call the cultural wars, for example, and it becomes really difficult to have conversations that can bring a whole bunch of people together around it. Could there be a more concrete, a smaller portion of work that can sort of sidesteps it, but draws in people together? And one of the things we were talking about was totally unrelated to climate change. I'm sure at some level we all live in this world, so I'm sure it's related to climate change, but not obviously. But a friend of mine gave birth to a child that has Down syndrome, and she was really shocked by the amount of advice she was getting about the possibility of terminating the pregnancy, because of the generally professionals were worried about the quality of life this child will have, the sort of pain and sacrifices that it will entail on the family. And so very out of a lot of concern, they were suggesting that. And it really, to this day, I mean, she's a Christian. We've never really talked about whether or not, what views she has about abortion, and that, so it's just just like a little bit like climate change. It's one of those things that are caught up in a cultural moment. Are you pro-life? Are you pro-choice? And it's very difficult to then have conversations across that divide, because people like boxing your box a certain way, then you're not listened to. People just like listening to things that affirm their views already. But yeah, so that experience really sort of shook her a little bit and made her think, some people might think it's okay to be pro-choice, and might be, or some people might think it's not okay to be pro-choice. But what are we saying about people having able bodies? Are they, and what are people, is this a little bit of, is it ableism? I think it's a technical word for this, what are we saying about people that are not, are we saying, that they're, are we all worthy of life? Just because we have this issue, should it be a challenge? And she came across this community of people from both sides, actually, funnily enough, people that are more pro-choice, people that are more pro-life, people that are Christians, people that are not Christians, that started to really deeply look into the rate of abortion for kids that have Down syndrome, for pregnancies involving children with Down syndrome. And I was just saying, sorry for rambling on. I wonder, because I'm at a point in my life where I'm convinced that I'm only changed by what I experience or what I see. It's less about, just having an abstract thought. If I'm somehow immersed in nature, if I'm immersed with my neighbor, if I'm doing life with someone, then that changes me. It's a significant encounter. It really transforms me. And it doesn't have to be this massive thing that I have to fight over. And I just, so it's a homework for me to take away. What might that look like in my life, and it might involve gardening, I don't know, but
Thanks, Roy. It's true. Sometimes it's really, really easy to talk about things in abstract terms with a lot of passion, and to actually stop seeing the humanity of the person who has a different opinion of you with equal passion. But sometimes it can be those concrete moments, like for you, Hannah, perhaps people joining you in that walk from London to Oxford, or witnessing that. And it was an experience, an encounter with an idea through people that facilitated this moment of ultimately generous conversation, but led to people from different ages, different denominations, different backgrounds coming together to work together for good. So as I was preparing for this conversation, and particularly looking at some of the points that you made in your paper, Amy, about practical responses that we can make, whether that's recycling or being involved in political lobbying, or things like what you're doing, Hannah, whether it's working with Hiroya or doing this pilgrimage walk, or Terry, the work that you're passionate about, creativity and innovation to solve some of the challenges we face. I was reminded again of an anecdote, especially that's true, especially in the face of large intractable challenges, such as the way we oftentimes perceive climate to be. And the story is there were 3 people, each of whom were standing side by side, digging a ditch. And, the first person was a little bit miserable about it. He's there in the hot sun of day, digging this hard earth and bearing little, to his mind, bearing little fruit. And so the first person, was asked, what are you doing? And he said, I'm just digging a ditch. And so the person standing next to him was asked the same question. He was a little bit more cheerful, a little bit more optimistic. And he was being asked, what are you doing? And his response was, I'm building a foundation. And the third person was absolutely cheerful and upbeat and, full of hope, actually, that was embodied in his action. And he was asked, what are you doing? And he said, I'm building a cathedral for future generations. And they were doing the exact same thing, but their understanding of what their actions were unto and the story that they were part of shaped their disposition. And I think for us, as we think about ways, whether practical, small ways, such as doing our recycling properly, or choosing to ride our bicycles more than driving, and choosing how, being ethical in our consumption, or devoting our lives to this cause, we can take joy and practice hope in knowing that actually, when we're doing these actions rooted in love, seeking to love God, love neighbor, and respond to this call to emulate Jesus in our life, we are participating in his ongoing work of recreation and redemption and love, which ultimately it is very powerful. And so I wanted to draw out just one comment. It's Nigel Cooper, you've written in the chat, which you said, hope is a spiritual discipline, not an estimate of probabilities. And to really leave us with that note that yes, we face tremendous challenges, and the issue of climate and environmental degradation and all of the complicating, complex factors that surround that is without doubt one of the foremost challenges of our time that not only invites, but calls us to participate in. And yet, amidst that, we are not people who are without hope. And I want to, leave us with that as an encouragement that we can participate, and we can do so from a place of real hope, not because of the merit of our actions alone, but because of ultimately this work of redemption of Christ's coming and entering into humanity, creation, death, and emerging triumphant in life. And so with that, I just want to thank our 4 speakers, our guests, and the experience, the background, the passion, the research that you've brought to this conversation. I want to thank our guests who have come to listen and to offer some comments and some questions, some of which have been addressed, some of which are being saved for future. But thank you so much for being part of this conversation, and have an excellent day. If you have any questions or comments, do feel free. I'll put my email address in the chat, and I'm happy to continue the conversation. If you've got any other things that come to mind from this, please don't hesitate to be in touch. So I'll officially close the event now, but do feel free if you want to stay on and continue the conversation. So thank you so much.